everyone. Thank you for coming out on this cold, brisk evening in New Jersey. And thank you for just making space in your hearts and your minds for, just this discussion about Black women and the question of politics. Because oftentimes those conversations just don't get enough space. And I just think it's so important. Having watched the debates yesterday and just observing the national political landscape and just the conversations around the centennial, the 19th Amendment, I just think it's so important just to pause and to think about the question of race, gender, power, politics, and how we can think about Black women's involvement in all of those spheres. And especially to think about shifting our perspectives. So I wanted to think about new perspectives or different ways of framing this conversation. So I wanted to start out with that sort of broad question of how to frame and sort of looking back and looking forward. So as I was kind of thinking about like how to start off this discussion, even though much of it will unfold in the 1960s, I wanted to go back to the 1860s and the Reconstruction period. And for me, I wanted to go back to my undergraduate years as well. And my undergraduate years were spent at SUNY Binghamton, upstate New York, where I had some amazing teachers. One of my teachers was Elsa Barkley Brown, who is now currently at the University of Maryland, College Park. And she's an amazing women's historian, and she works on Black political power and Black politics in the larger sense of things. And she really, I think, has given us so many models and frameworks for thinking through how to frame our understanding of so many concepts in U.S. history. So I'm going to offer some of her frameworks as models for us to think about this later period and then think about the earlier period as well. So scholars have been so excited about planning so many retrospectives for this year. Scholars have been planning 2020 for over a decade. Women's historians, so many events have been planned, especially around K-12 education, thinking about how to raise the questions of women voting, political power in K-12 classrooms, how to connect that kind of curricular questioning with what are some of the more richer insights that come from what professional historians have uncovered around the question of suffrage, right? Those complex questions about race, about exclusion, about where suffrage took place, thinking beyond suffrage in many ways as well. So on the one hand, while you've probably seen many articles and essays around the question of voting in a bigger sense and the celebration of the 19th Amendment, you've probably also seen articles like this, raising the question of who was left out of that narrative, right? So this is an example of a New York Times article. And there have been many, not many, but there have been several well-placed and highly visible essays which have reminded that although there were these moments where it seemed like access was increased for some, that access did not extend to all, right? And in fact, some of the ways that the doors were opened for some actually shut the doors for others, right? So that very process of opening the doors for some shut the doors for others, right? So you may have seen articles like this. So thinking about what I wanted to start off with today, it made me go back to my undergraduate years and some concepts that I learned from Dr. Elsa Barkley Brown in one of her seminal articles that I read that was called To Catch the Vision of Freedom, which is an older book now, right? It was published in 1997. It was an essay that she wrote that was published first as an article, and that was published in that edited collection. It was called "To Catch the Vision of Freedom: Reconstructing Southern Black Women's Political History, 1865 to 1880." And in that essay, she argues that one, Black women had a political history in this time period, at a time where many people argued that they did not have a political history because they did not have a vote, right? So she looks at this question of suffrage as a narrowing of the political conversation, as a narrowing of an understanding of politics. So this is what she says, quote, and she connects suffrage to freedom. All right, so she says, quote, "After emancipation, African American women, as part of Black communities throughout the South, struggled to define on their own terms the meaning of freedom. Much of the literature on Reconstruction era African American women's political history has focused on the debates over on the national level over the 15th Amendment, which revolved around the question whether enfranchisement of African American men in the 15th Amendment or the enfranchisement of women should take precedence." And she talks about how the discussions and debates over the 15th Amendment oftentimes silenced the very real political activity that Black women were still managing to engage in, despite the fact that they were not able to go down and vote. So she invites us into thinking about, well, what else were people doing if they couldn't vote? If the levers of power were unable to be pulled in that way, what else were they doing? And I think it's a question for us to think about in election years, when the question of politics, dominates the political landscape in ways that it doesn't on non-election years, right? Because, but what else are we doing for politics on our non-election years, for example? Are we voting as vigorously when there are not presidential elections to vote in, for example? Right, so she's asking us to think about, well, what are Black women doing? So she goes on to argue that their traditions of collectivism, of mutuality, that the political behavior of Black women kind of reflect this ethos. It's challenging the idea of a vote being an individual possession. And she argues that, in fact, the vote that Black men were casting in this early period in the 1860s was really a collective vote. She calls it a family vote, right? This ideal that Black women had influence through the influence they had in their family, through their influence on their family members, and that they had these tremendous influence this way. And they were also able to engage in lots of other types of political behaviors, right? And in a lot of ways, it kind of asks us to think about different frameworks for understanding Black women's political behavior outside of an engagement in formal politics, right? And it invites us into thinking about what they can do when those avenues are closed, or when it invites us to see the activities that they're doing in addition to spending their energies trying to engage in formal politics, right? So that's the first thing I wanted to say as one of my takeaways. I'm telling you up front. The second takeaway is about quilting. Another seminal article that Dr. Elsa Barkley Brown wrote was called African American Women's Quilting. It appeared in Signs in 1989, and she talks about quilting as a metaphor and a methodology for understanding women's history. And she talks about quilting as a way of understanding how to put women's history together. She talks about jazz and improvisation. She talks about the way that rhythms come together in different ways. She talks about offbeat patterning. She talks about designs that seem not to have any synchronicity, but are still harmonious when looked at from afar, that still makes sense, right? She talks about the intricacy of designs that are controlled. She talks about traditions that seem like they are unfolding on top of each other, but that simply aren't linear. These are ways of understanding time, right? It allows us to think about a narrative of thinking about Black women's political participation in the wake of emancipation and Black women's political participation in the 1960s, not as a march of progress, but as something that can be folded and braided together in a way that makes political sense. I'm going to pause for a moment. Unfortunately, I think I have an alarm that I forgot to shut off, which I'm hearing now. Sorry about this. Is my pickup daughter from leave house to pickup daughter from ballet. Someone else is doing this. Yes. Someone else has got that covered. Yeah. Someone else has got that covered today. Okay. So the idea is that when we think about Black women's politics, we have to be willing to think about it in ways that allow politics to be complex and to be nonlinear, right? So when we think about this idea of the first Reconstruction and then the second Reconstruction, which is a concept that another mentor of mine, Manning Marable, talked about, the civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction, as a second iteration of this attempt to remake, to reconstruct, that it's not about a timeline per se, but perhaps thinking about it in terms of this quilt, right? Thinking about what scraps did people take from one era and bring into the other, right? What work was unfinished that they tried to continue to finish in other eras, right? And what ways in which Black women were at the forefront in leading the charge, even though it may have seemed that they were the ones with the least political power, right? They were the ones that had the least access. They were the ones that were furthest away from the ballot, right? But perhaps that meant that they were still on the front lines despite that. So keeping all of those frameworks in mind, I wanted to move on because I think I wanted to sort of start with that because I think sometimes the narratives around suffrage end up being, well, women got the right to vote. Well, not all women. Okay, well, not all women. I'll just add in the women of color and keep my narrative going, right? But let's challenge that. Let's ask, well, what else did women do outside of voting? What else did politics look like, right, for women? And in what ways did women try to radicalize what politics looked like? They tried to vote, maybe they radicalized that space, but they did engage in so many other things that they also considered to be deeply, deeply political. So that leads us to Miss Ella Baker. So I wanted to start with Ella Baker because in a lot of ways her story allows us to think about political power in ways that engage voting but are bigger than voting. Right? So Ella Baker is an important character in U.S. history because she was a character that was an ideologue. Right? So in other words, she's important not just because of her actions as an activist, but because of her ideas and the ways that her ideas were also utilized by many people after her as models of action. Right? So beyond what she did, it was the way she thought and the way that other people kept her thoughts and her ideas and used them as models for their engagement, right? So Ella Baker was an activist who was involved in many different types of movements, from the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, through the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, in the 1960s. She had a long career of activism. In between there, she was also involved in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, working with Dr. Martin Luther King. She's someone who relished and had ideas around leadership, right? This quote here, "Give light and people will find the way." She believed that groups and organizations should be centered around collectives and not individual leaders, right? So she talked about group-centered leadership, not necessarily leader-centered groups, right? So that meant that she found it politically expedient to be behind the scenes, right? She thought that what a leader should do is cultivate leadership in others, not necessarily grab the spotlight and use that to articulate the best analysis, to share their opinions, et cetera, et cetera. Another wonderful quote from her, where she says, "I've always felt it was a handicap for oppressed peoples to depend so largely upon the leader, because unfortunately in our culture, this charismatic leader usually becomes a leader because he has found a spot in the public limelight." And the he is not coincidental. Oftentimes the person that is perceived as leader and who is given the mantle as leader were men. Ella Baker worked through many organizations where the authority of men was presumed to be absolute, whether it be her work through churches or other male-dominated organizations. This was important because as the Black freedom movement was gearing up, especially in the period after World War II, the question of who would lead was just as important for people as what would they fight, what would we fight, well, how would we fight? Right? We knew what would we fight against. We'd be fighting against Jim Crow, segregation, we'd be fighting for voting rights, we'd be fighting against segregation, for freedom, for liberation. But the reality is that ideals about who should be at the forefront were seen as very critical, with the idea of women being at the forefront seen as actually a danger, right? A danger, a threat, about sending a message about the Black community being non-patriarchal, non-normative, et cetera, sending a negative image about Black manhood, right? All of those things were seen as negative. It wasn't all hands on deck. It was, let's present a particular viewpoint of what Black struggle looks like, and that viewpoint should look like patriarchy, right? And that was clearly stated, right? And by men and women. So this was the context in which people like Ella Baker found her way. Now, you had women that contested that as well, and found space around and outside of that. But that was definitely something that they had to deal with, right? So thinking about Ella Baker's organizing and her political philosophies. So she started out being part of a group called the Young Negro Cooperative League in 1930 during the time of the Great Depression. She brought people together to collaborate, to share together, right? The idea of coming together to cooperate during the Great Depression, because why? Because they could not depend on the federal government relief programs to assist them in the same way. this should make you hearken back to what I just said about how Elsa Barkley Brown defined catching that vision of freedom, right? Where she said that, for African American women in that post-Reconstruction moment, in that post-Civil War moment during Reconstruction, they articulated collectivist understandings of what freedom looked like and how freedom would be defined, right? This was one example of that collective idea. She was also part of the NAACP as field secretary, working with them for many years, from 1938 to 46, then again in 1952. As field secretary, she traveled. She had an immense network of people who were willing to stand up at a time where being part of the NAACP was an incredibly dangerous and brave stance to take in places where oftentimes there was a lot of isolation and there was a lot of backlash to challenging the racial status quo and the racial hierarchy at the time. So Ella Baker developed an immense network of people who were the foot soldiers, who were willing to stand up in their small towns and small cities throughout the South. She started an organization called In Friendship in 1956, and they rallied support for the people who were striking during the Montgomery bus boycott, who were boycotting the buses. So organized people to support the Montgomery bus boycott. She was part of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in a leadership position, the first executive director, where she clashed with a young minister named Dr. Martin Luther King over questions of leadership, of vision. You can imagine that Dr. King, who was coming into his own after the Montgomery bus boycott, where he was basically picked from obscurity as a young minister, and that was his first real national platform. And by this point, Ella Baker had done all of the things that I mentioned. She was coming in as the seasoned activist with the Rolodex full of, networks. And, she had all of this history behind her. And you can imagine that the strong personas clashed. So she only stayed there for 1 year. Then she was associated with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in 1960. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee ended up being the organization, which was the key organization which launched students into southern towns and cities to mobilize, work with, and to activate local people and work alongside of them as they started to stand up, register to vote, and take actions to transform the heart and soul of the South. So when you see the Freedom Rides, when you see, Freedom Summer, all of the major campaigns of the civil rights movement that come to mind, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, is typically behind that. And the way that they are is modeled after Ella Baker's support. She was their mentor. She encouraged them when they got together and they launched their first set of sit-ins, and all of the adult organizations came out and was so excited to just absorb the young people and their young energy. She said, be your own organization. Don't join any of these organizations. Be your own group. And they took her advice and they became their own organization. They followed many of her mantras about strong people don't need strong leaders. They governed by consensus. They talked everything out. They did not have strong leaders that were, in front of microphones a lot. They governed collectively. And they provided a space for local people to have a say over the running of their own life. They did not enter southern towns with an agenda for people to follow. They went in, they asked people what they needed. They stayed with them. They lived alongside of them. They didn't run in, do an action, make things really dangerous for the people, and then run out, right? They stayed. That's what they were known for, staying. And they really stood on the shoulders of people like Ella Baker. So many of the voting rights actions that took place on smaller levels, that chipped away at Southern states' resistance to giving African Americans any access to the ballot box, were won by the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee following Ella Baker's philosophy. Right? Now her philosophy gets hidden in that, right? But it's what is the gas in the engine, right? It's Ella Baker that's fueling, right, the successes that lead to things like the Voting Rights Act, right? Right, that is what is the success behind that, right? She is the philosopher that is being followed when those things are happening. So she in some ways becomes kind of like the invisible hand that is pushing those successes forward, right? But we don't tend to know her name. So I wanted to also add two great books about her. Barbara Ransby is her biographer, wonderful book, Ella Baker and the Black Freedom Movement. There's a great chapter in there called The Preacher and the Organizer that I always have my students read in as many classes as possible. That's the Dr. King, Ella Baker chapter, because it's oftentimes hard for them to grasp the multiplicity of things that are going on all at once. That, yes, there's Dr. King, but yes, there's also a larger framework of understandings about women and women's roles at the time, that he's operating in that context as well, right? So he's also part of that, and that there were people, yes, to the left of Dr. King, right? There were people who were pushing Dr. King, you know, in certain directions. The Dr. King grew over time, right? He was not just the same person in all of these different moments, right? And that's a great also book by Todd Moy, another professor, excellent book, which looks at Ella Baker through the lens of being a community organizer, which I also love, just focusing on the work that she did as an organizer, right? And also her legacy. So I just wanted to highlight those books. And Ella Baker as an engine, thinking about her as somebody who is responsible for the voting successes that African Americans had during the civil rights movement. Now to turn to Fannie Lou Hamer, who is another person that people oftentimes don't hear a lot about when they think about women in the civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. She's a little earlier, but she does continue on through the Black Power movement as well. So I love talking about Fannie Lou Hamer because she had such a interesting and unique life. Have people heard about Fannie Lou Hamer? Raise your hand if you've heard about Fannie Lou Hamer. Well, that's great. So Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper, which I think is important to note. The thing that's happened to her and her story is that at one point nobody had heard of her, and then she kind of became the emblem of a local person who was very, very poor, who had struggled. She was the youngest of 20 children. She was a sharecropper who had become radicalized by SNCC, who left the land that she was on, and she became a spokesperson and an example of bravery and the power of voice and really the intellect, the everyday intellect that existed amongst working class people of the South. Right. Unfortunately, Fannie Lou Hamer's also become kind of emptied and frozen in that particular moment of her life. Much like we see Dr. King kind of frozen in his I Have a Dream speech, like we've seen Rosa Parks frozen on the bus, right? We've tried to get Rosa off the bus, She's been a little off the bus now. We know that she was doing stuff beforehand, and she was organizing women for women's fight against rape and sexual, violence. We know that she went off to Detroit afterwards and was doing all these things. We know that Dr. King came out against Vietnam and was doing other things. For Fannie Lou Hamer, we want to know that she was doing other things, after her famous speech that I'm going to talk about now. She did quite a lot of things in her life, and she grew and became even more radical later on. So what she's really known for is speaking out and advocating for political voice for poor people in Mississippi. She's also known as somebody who helped to organize the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. More people, I think, need to really know about what that process involved, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. I'm going to pause. I'm going to go to those links which have her speech, and I'm going to come back to that, but I'm going to go ahead a little bit because I want to show that picture there, which has the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party there. So, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party was a political party in Mississippi that was organized to basically demonstrate that poor black people in Mississippi did want to participate in the political process. This was a question mark, unfortunately. Right? Black people in Mississippi were barred from the lily white Democratic Party. And there were people who doubted that these sharecroppers wanted to vote. There's a great clip online with Charles Cobb, a SNCC member, saying that there were people who said, yes, it's violent, but those people want to vote anyway, right? Aren't they just apathetic? They don't have any education anyway. Right? So they said, well, we're going to create a mock election, and we're going to show. So they had a freedom registration where they went around and said, we're going to create our own Democratic Party, and we're going to show that anyone can register. It doesn't have to be just black people. Anyone who wants to register for our Democratic Party can register, right? And then they had their own Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party convention, which was here. Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people became, went down. They signed up. They talked about how they had all of these meetings. They broke down the way that they organized it. The fact that for the regular Democratic Party, they would just be meeting and choosing delegates at bars. Bob, you want to become a delegate? That was the process. And if you dared to show up, you were either escorted out at gunpoint and things like that. So how they had to hammer away to try to make a democratic process, and how people who were so scared at first learned to do that, in the strength in numbers they got out of that whole organizing process. And yet, all of that led Fannie Lou Hamer and those numbers of people to Atlantic City in 1964, which is the more official story that we get. In 1964, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party sent their delegates down to Atlantic City to confront those lily white Democratic Party delegates and to say, hey, we're actually the real Democratic Party from Mississippi, because we were created from a democratic process, not your racist, exclusionary process. And they created a crisis. And in that moment, Fannie Lou Hamer took to the stage and she spoke. And many people don't know that she was not the only speaker. Dr. King spoke. Other people spoke also. But her speech was a speech that captured the imagination of the country, because she spoke in plain language and she spoke about her reality at the time, talking about the violence and terrorism that people had gone through for the simple right to vote. And she talked in plain language again about what was keeping black women from voting. It wasn't their gender, right? It was about their race and their class, plus their gender, right? She put it all together, right? She said it was our position. It was the fact that we were in this excluded, we were excluded for all of these reasons, right? This is why we couldn't vote, right? We know we had that amendment all those years ago, right? But we still can't vote. Right? So I'm going to play a clip from that so you can see, and then some framing. And then I want to say that she did more things. So she had that moment in the convention where she's typically frozen, but then she went on. She created a collective farm where she had people fighting for economic power. And she said, again, let's pool our resources, right? And let's try to farm together and bring poor farmers together so we don't have to be sharecroppers dependent on white landowners. Let's pool our money together and try to farm collectively. She ran for office with 2 other people as well, Victoria Gray Adams and others, and she was able to, run and be successful on that endeavor as well. She spoke out against the U.S. war in Vietnam and other things. She was a radical. And I think people don't know that, Fannie Lou Hamer, right? That she was actually a strategist. It's easier to think about her as kind of a simple woman, right? Who kind of had her moment, but she was a radical woman as well. So I'm gonna play this, which is just the speech, and then I'm gonna play the second one, which has more framing. This might be the framing.
The testimony before the Credentials Committee, the FDP had a lineup of very different people. They had Rita Schwerner, the widow of Mickey, who had been killed in Neshoba County. They had Martin Luther King. Everybody knew King.
The seating of the delegation from the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party has political and moral significance far beyond the borders of Mississippi. Of the halls of this convention.
But the highlight of the testimony was that of Fannie Lou Hamer, the sharecropper who had been evicted from her plantation, had come to symbolize the Mississippi movement.
Mr. Chairman, and to the Credentials Committee, it was the 31st of August in 1962 that 18 of us traveled 26 miles the county courthouse in Indianola to try to register to become first-class citizens. We was met in Indianola by policemen.
The president, Andrew Johnson, he's not afraid of Martin Luther King's testimony. He's afraid of Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony. And so he decides that the country should not see her testify live.
Johnson was in the White House, and he convened an impromptu press conference.
We will return to this scene in Atlantic City, but now we switch to the White House and NBC's Robert Goralski.
Now, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
On this day, 9 months ago,
He did it knowing that they would break away, thinking he might announce who his choice of vice president was going to be. Instead, he gets up there and he announces, get this, he announces that it's 9 months to the day since Governor Connolly, who was there, was shot along with President Kennedy. So he announced a 9-month anniversary. Everybody's scratching their heads.
thank you very much.
And then he leaves. By that time, Fannie Lou Hamer's testimony was over. However, it backfired on Johnson because it became a story that she had been taken off television and in the news that night, and for days afterwards, they replayed her testimony.
I was carried to the county jail and put in the booking room. They left some of the people in the booking room and began to place us in cells.
She had Mississippi in her bones. Martin Luther King or the Smithfield secretaries, they couldn't do what Fannie Lou Hamer did. They couldn't be a sharecropper and express what it meant, right? And that's what Fannie Lou Hamer did.
And it wasn't too long before 3 white men came to my cell. One of these men was State Highway Patrol. He said, we're going to make you wish you was dead.
I'm going to pause that. The reason why I decided to put a second link is that it bothered me that they like talked over her entire speech in that one. So I'm going to go back now. I see that I have that one there twice. Okay. Yeah. All right, I'm going to maybe move on because it was actually hard to find one that was just the speech, which is just, I'm just going to give it one more try. Let's see. Then I'll move on. All right, I'm going to move forward. Sorry about that, I think. But what I wanted you to hear, well, you got part of it. In it, she talks about the sexual violence that she faced when she was arrested. In that particular segment that was there. But there's a part where she says, you know, is this America, land of the free, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hook because our lives are threatened nightly. And it's just really moving, you know, because she's really giving you a sense of what it's like, you know, to be wanting to simply register to vote. And that's your reality, right? And I think there's something about it that is so touching. And I think at the same time, I wanted to highlight that Fannie Lou Hamer continued on, you know, doing different things, evolving, and it also becoming more radicalized. Fannie Lou Hamer was somebody, she went to New York several times. She spoke in different ways. She spoke alongside radicals like May Mallory. She connected with people like even Malcolm X. She was somebody who was not just the sharecropper who sort of represented rural Mississippi, but she was somebody who grew and eventually represented a radical politic. And oftentimes she's not understood like that. So I wanted to just also bring that out about her life. And also because I think she represents why some of those barriers to voting were there and what those barriers to voting looked like for women, right? Because I think oftentimes when we think about, well, why didn't people want women to vote, we sometimes think about understandings about gender, right, and solely gender, right, women's inequality, things like that. When we think about, you can't separate that from also race and class as well. So I also wanted to highlight that. Now, the last thing I wanted to say was something about women in the Black Panther Party as well, because women in the Black Panther Party also, as radical women, played a key role in raising the question of elections and participating in electoral politics as well. The Black Panther Party was founded in 1966 by Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. It would grow to become one of the most well-known Black power organizations in the U.S. It was also an international organization with an international chapter in Algeria. It was modeled, it provided a model for different entities all over the world. eventually, and they did participate in election campaigns as well. So I wanted to show some images from that and talk about that really briefly as well. So I wanted to say the Panthers were part of election campaigns even after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which had a big impact on, of course, Black voting possibilities and behaviors, right? In many ways, the Voting Rights Act empowered more African American women in particular than, the amendment that we're celebrating the centennial of, right? But for radicals, they oftentimes looked at the possibilities that existed in different ways. So looking at, for example, third-party campaigns. So the image on the left is Panther leader Kathleen Cleaver, who is running for Assembly District on the Peace and Freedom Party ballot. And the goal there is to really raise awareness around the Panthers' political prisoners in 1968, and to also highlight the Panthers' alliances with white leftists at the time and the white left at the time, and make that connection as well. So the Panthers did align themselves with the white left. And they also did a lot of voter registration activity, which is not something that they're known for, but they did register many people to vote as part of their political work. They ran tightly organized political campaigns, especially as they evolved over time into the 1970s. In the 1970s, you have Panther leaders Elaine Brown running for councilwoman and Bobby Seale running for mayor of Oakland, where they did a lot of voter registration. So, for example, between November 1972 and March 1973, they registered close to 15,000 people to vote in Oakland, California alone. So voter registration was a big part of their strategy. And here they ran on the Democratic Party ticket. So they used this idea of voter registration and political power as a way of strategizing for addressing some of the needs of Black people in Oakland, whether it be housing, addressing the unequal education that was still a reality, addressing police brutality, which was still a reality at the time. In addition to these campaigns, they also ran on the local level and encouraged people to keep their eye on local campaigns for different types of school districts, for lower offices as well, understanding that those things had an impact on how people experience the day-to-day, right? That oftentimes it was those elected offices that had the impact that people felt in their neighborhoods, perhaps more than thinking about mayors, right? It might have an impact more on your school or what's happening with your trash, those kinds of things. So they encourage people to also be part of the local election machinery as well. So that was also something that they were part of. In particular, I wanted to highlight that during their campaign for Bobby Seale's mayor campaign, they also utilized some civil rights movement strategies. They leaned on some of Fannie Lou Hamer's strategies. She was known for singing "This Little Light of Mine." So they used some of those lyrics and they changed it. If you want a job, vote for Brother Bob. Keep employment down, vote for Elaine Brown. And they tried to use, look at the legacy of some of the cultural ways that civil rights activists had mobilized people for elections and use those as ways. So again, thinking about that bending of time and using of the strategies of the past in different time periods as part of what they were doing as well. And also thinking about creating broad alliances of supporters and networks, right? And creating like broad networks, just like Ella Baker did. So networking amongst the communities that they were part of, as well as networking amongst queer communities as well. So they were very much interested in sort of bringing all of that together. So those are some of the ways that I wanted to kind of highlight that African American women in particular had an impact on having a vision for what freedom would look like and having politics be the center of that vision, whether it be thinking through what leadership should look like and how voting should be one of many strategies, perhaps the hub of the wheel, but having a constellation of strategies that are happening alongside of the electoral strategy that are simultaneous. I think that's very, very important to sort of keep in mind, because oftentimes the electoral strategy can feel like the only one or the most urgent one, or the one that kind of takes up all of the energy or all of that. But important to think about long-term, short-term strategies as well. Also thinking about Ella Baker's long-term contribution to the idea of people mobilizing themselves and thinking long and hard about what leadership looks like and why it's important to move and act collectively and to strategize about what a leader should look like and how groups should organize themselves, to think about Fannie Lou Hamer's contributions and her long-term impact, and becoming suspicious of people who seem to become models that replace older models. So now you kind of, Fannie Lou Hamer is it becomes the person to talk about instead of Dr. King, because she's the grassroots hero to talk about instead of him, who's like the top down or the more high ranking sort of person. So she becomes the person to kind of counter that. But yet, by talking about her solely, there's so many Fannie Lou Hamers, right? There's so many Martin Luther Kings. I think we have to multiply the things that we talk about, the people that we talk about. We have to learn new things about the old people that we know about, and we have to learn new people, right? So we want to learn new things about King. We want to learn new things about Fannie Lou Hamer, about Rosa Parks. And we want to learn new people, right, to complicate and add to our story so that we're learning new characters in this narrative of what the Black freedom movement looks like. And when we hear these stories about, how we should feel and how we should celebrate this centennial of the 19th Amendment, important to think about, just not adding people to the story, but to try to tell a new story. A story that can be a little more inclusive, that can be a little more critical, that can move us to a new national narrative, that can be something that can get closer to how it really was. So thank you.